talking about feminist theories this week, it's important to think about contemporary feminist movements, and specifically not just feminism from the perspective of cisgender women, but also from the perspective of transgender women. And I want to just kind of clarify, just in case you may not have, in case you're not familiar with the term cis or trans. So to be cisgender means that your gender identity coheres with or agrees with the sex that you were assigned to. So for example, I was assigned female at birth and I identify as a woman in society, or someone could have been assigned male at birth and identify as a man in society. So cis, that means cisgender or cissexual, or cis means same as or on the same side of. So when it comes to trans though, if someone identifies as trans, that means their gender identity doesn't necessarily cohere with or agree with the sex that they were assigned to at birth. So for example, in Julia Serrano's perspective and her lived experiences in the Transwoman Manifesto, someone could have been assigned a male at birth, but then identify as a woman. Or someone could have been assigned a female at birth, but then identify as a man. And there's also cases where someone could be non-binary and they may not necessarily identify with being exclusively a woman or a man, or they may have differing gender identities throughout the day or throughout the week, etc. So there's a diversity of gender identities, but specifically we're thinking about what it means to be a trans woman from Julia Serrano's perspective, who is an activist and a scholar. She's a writer, she does spoken word, and also how feminism needs to be inclusive towards trans women because feminism has not been inclusive towards trans women. So in order to think about the issues that come along with being transgender in a society that is primarily cis-sexist, let's think about transmisogyny and transphobia and all these aspects or these isms that she's talking about that are really bad. So she says that we live in a society in the US that has a lot of transphobia. And so what is transphobia? Well, just think about the term phobia. It's an irrational fear or aversion to people whose gendered identities differentiate from societal norms. So she says that someone's own transphobia relates to their insecurities about living up to our culture's ideals. So for example, I as a cis woman could be really transphobic towards trans women, and I could say things like, oh, well, they're not real women, but that could have to do with my own insecurity with living up to the ideals of being a woman in this society. So oftentimes, if someone is phobic about something, it's not really about that other person or that group of people. It's really about their own issues. But she says that in order to understand transphobia, we have to understand it in relation to cis-sexism in society. So cis-sexism is the institutional structure that allows things like transphobia to exist. It's basically identifying transgender individuals and saying that they are inferior to cisgender individuals, or that they're less authentic than cisgender individuals, that their identities aren't real, that they aren't valid, that it's just a phase or something. Not giving cisgender or transgender people the same rights and opportunities as cisgender people. Those are examples of cis-sexism. It's the institutionalization of transphobia and of prejudice against trans people. So insofar as we live in a cis-sexist society, meaning that we are privileging cisgender identity over transgender identity, then we're not necessarily giving trans people the same rights and opportunities as we are with cisgender people. And so she says that we live in a society where we are denying trans people basic privileges and opportunities. So for example, not covering certain aspects of hormone replacement therapy or top and bottom surgery on someone's health insurance, because those are really expensive procedures, those are really expensive processes, and so to not cover those or not have those as be part of someone's health insurance is an example of cis-sexism. Or not allowing someone to use a bathroom that they identify with. So by saying, oh, you can only use this bathroom based off of what's on your state ID, instead of how someone actually feels about their own gender identity. And so another example of it could be not respecting someone's pronouns or not respecting someone's name. So my pronouns are she or her. It could be someone calling me he or they, or not calling me by the name specifically if I were trans, if that were an issue for me, if that was my lived experience. So sometimes people can forget someone's proper pronouns or names, but it's when someone is intentionally not respecting someone's pronouns. So, for example, someone who is trans could have been found dead, and then the newspaper publication only refers to them by their dead name or by the incorrect gender pronouns. So it's clear we live in a cis-sexist society. In order to understand how to overcome cis-sexism and transphobia, we have to think about certain established ideas in our society that allow these negative structures to continue to exist. So she talks about traditional misogyny and how that's related to transmisogyny and transsexism. So she says that regular misogyny, right? We talked about feminism in the prior video. Regular misogyny or traditional misogyny is basically assuming that those who are masculine have power over those who are feminine, and that anything that's not masculine or anything that's feminine is inferior or less than what is viewed as masculine. And so if someone is being misogynistic, they're deriding and dismissing women or femaleness or femininity in relation to masculinity. And so she says that trans women are specifically negatively impacted also by misogyny because they are sensationalized and objectified and sexualized constantly. So in order to think about overcoming transphobia and cis-sexism, we have to really think about misogyny, because trans women experience the highest rates of violence within the LGBTQ plus community, and specifically trans women of color, African American trans women, face the highest rates of violence and murder and bullying. And so therefore we have to think, well, why? Clearly there's this intersectionality between racism and sexism happening here, and why are people so uncomfortable with trans women? Why is this notion that someone is expressing their femininity and they weren't necessarily assigned that specific sex that we think coheres with femininity? Why is that so disturbing to people? Because we see how people are more disturbed by that than trans men. So what is it about womanhood? What is it about femininity that is so disgusting to people? And so that's why we have to think about traditional misogyny and how that negatively impacts trans women. And then she says we have to think about this in relation to transmisogyny. So we have traditional misogyny, which is negating and deriding femininity and femaleness. And then the other layer of that is transmisogyny, which is basically saying that trans women are not valid. There are many jokes that are made at the expense of trans women. Think about so many popular TV shows and comedies and just things that people say in their daily conversations, where it's this view that trans women are not authentic and there's something wrong with them, or there's something disgusting, and that they're perverted, and that they're just trying to do it to get a rise out of people. And that's not what's happening with trans women, but that's an example of transmisogyny. So thinking about how there's a lot of violence against trans women, thinking about how some women's organizations and feminist organizations don't open their doors to trans women, and they say that trans women aren't real women. Those are examples of transmisogyny. So how does this intersect then, transmisogyny, how does this intersect with traditional sexism against women in our society? So she talks about how the media hyperfeminizes trans women. So they are always viewed as, when they are, the limited times that they are portrayed, they are wearing a lot of lipstick, a lot of makeup, high heels, very tight clothing, and so they're viewed as being hyper feminine. But you can be a trans woman and you don't necessarily have to be hyper feminine. She also talks about how the media hypersexualizes them. So oftentimes if trans women are portrayed, they are portrayed solely as sex workers, as people who are hired to have sex with other individuals, rather than someone being a trans woman teacher or a trans woman web developer, right? There's just so many ways that you can represent people, but if you only represent people a certain way, then you're perpetuating stereotypes about them. And she also says that the media objectifies trans women's bodies. So she says that they sensationalize sex reassignment surgery. If there is a trans character in a show, the plot line is typically about how they are trying to get bottom surgery, and that's kind of their whole plot line. So how can we overcome transmisogyny? How can we overcome constantly normalizing cisgender identity, privileging cisgender people? How can we transcend this notion that trans people are inferior to cisgender people, and specifically trans women, because they're dealing not only with transphobia, but they're dealing with transmisogyny, transsexism, all of those negative isms in society, because we live in a society that views femininity as inferior. So people think, well, why would someone give up their male privilege to be a woman? And that's obviously a mistaken perception that people have. So how can we overcome this really negative oppression against trans women? And so she says that we have to challenge binary gender norms. What is the binary? Saying that you can only be a man or you can only be a woman, and that's it. So we have to recognize that people's identities are all over the place. They're outside of the binary, they're in the binary, it's a whole spectrum. It also challenges the idea that femininity is inferior to masculinity, because if we don't believe in such a rigid binary, then we don't necessarily think that one is superior than the other. We could think about it as being relational to one another, and as both of these aspects of identity being equal to one another, rather than femininity being less than masculinity. She also talks about how trans activism must be a feminist movement. So feminists must be inclusive towards trans women, and the trans movement must also be focusing on sexism as well. And so she says that as a society, we need to empower femininity in itself. And how could we do that? Well, we could embrace femininity in terms of saying, you know what, celebrating people's femininity instead of thinking, oh, this is inferior and pathetic. She says that it takes loads of strength and loads of courage for anyone to embrace their femme self. So for trans women, for trans men, for cis women, for cis men, it takes loads of power and strength, because femininity is looked down upon in society. And so we should embrace it and empower it and think about it as being this wonderful aspect of one's identity. We also shouldn't just assume that just because someone is wearing feminine clothing or they have a feminine manner that they want to be they want to be bossed around, or that they are submissive or passive. You can wear feminine clothing and still be assertive and dominant. You don't have to be viewed as this passive thing. So these are just some of the examples that she talks about of how to overcome transmisogyny. But I think one of the most important ones is to get away from this notion that there are the opposite sexes and that there's only the male and the female, or the man and the woman when it comes to gender, and to get rid of this oppositional thinking and say, you know what, we have these genders and they're not just on opposite ends of one another, but one person can have multiple genders within them and multiple ways of expressing themselves, and we shouldn't try to prevent people from living their authentic genders when it comes to thinking about this through an existentialist lens.